Anna's icy fingers tightened around the old backpack in the corner of the bus stop. Seattle rain had soaked through her thin hoodie, and each gust of night wind drained the last traces of warmth from her small body. 3 days ago, her stepmother had thrown her out of the house. 3 days of wandering, 3 days with nowhere to belong, and tonight she could vanish into this vast city without anyone ever knowing. Then, amid the rain and the darkness, came the sound of footsteps, slow, steady, belonging to a man carrying the scars of war and a heart that had not yet had time to heal, a meeting that would change her life forever. The November night wind in Seattle swept through the empty streets, carrying a biting chill. John Miller pulled his collar up higher and kept a steady pace along the damp sidewalk left behind by the afternoon rain. He had just gotten off his shift at the warehouse down by the port. After his years in Afghanistan, being able to walk home along these quiet streets felt like a luxury. He was accustomed to the stillness of late night, when the city slipped into sleep and only the sound of his own footsteps echoed on the pavement. But tonight was different. As he passed the old bus stop on the corner of 15th Avenue, John noticed a figure, small, huddled, hidden in a dark corner beneath the peeling awning. He stopped. In the darkness, his eyes long trained to scan for danger in the desert, quickly recognized that it was a child, a girl, about 12 years old, wearing an oversized hoodie, her arms wrapped tightly around an old backpack, as if it were the only thing she had left. The instincts of a former soldier wouldn't let John walk past. He changed direction and slowly approached the bus stop. "Hi there," he said softly, keeping a safe distance. "Are you all right?" The girl startled, her gaze snapping toward him. She pressed herself back against the wall, both hands gripping the backpack strap so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her pale blue eyes gleamed in the darkness, sharp and wary. "Go away," she said flatly. "I don't need help." John stopped. He didn't step back, but he didn't move forward either. The look in her eyes made his chest tighten. It wasn't the look of a frightened child. It was the look of someone who had learned how to survive, bristling, ready to bite if cornered. He had seen that look before. In Kabul, in the children who wandered around the military base, orphans who learned to read danger in an adult's face before they ever learned to read words. Children who grew old too soon. "I understand," John said, his voice low and even. He slowly took off his denim jacket, making sure she could see every movement. "I'll leave this here. It's really cold tonight." He placed the jacket on the bench at the bus stop, a few steps away from her. The girl didn't respond, only stared at the jacket as if it might be a trap. John backed away and crossed the street to a large maple tree. He sat down with his back against the trunk, legs stretched out on the sidewalk. From there, he could keep an eye on the street and the bus stop without making her feel watched. Time passed. 10 minutes. 20. Out of the corner of his eye, John saw her move. She slowly stood up, still clutching the backpack, her gaze sweeping the area like a small animal preparing to leave its den. She stepped toward the jacket, her fingers brushing the fabric. Then, in a lightning-fast motion, she snatched it up, slipped it on, and retreated back to her corner. John let out a quiet breath of relief. The jacket hung far too big on her, the sleeves drooping over her hands. But at least she was warmer. He didn't move. He just sat there, like a silent tree standing guard. Memories flooded his mind, long nights on watch in the desert, when he and his fellow soldiers sat in silence, protecting whatever fragments of hope remained amid the rubble. Tonight, what he was guarding was only a lost girl in the dark. But perhaps this was the most important mission he had ever been given. And in the Seattle night, two figures, a man and a girl, sat in silence, each in their own corner, connected by an invisible thread of understanding. No words yet, no promises yet, just presence. And sometimes, that is all a wounded soul needs, to believe that, in this world, there is still someone willing to stay. The light in John Miller's small apartment was gentle, like a whisper. An old table lamp cast a warm golden glow over the simple furnishings, a dark brown sofa, a pine bookcase holding a few books on mechanics, and a framed photograph of a group of soldiers standing beneath a desert sky. Anna sat on the sofa, one hand still gripping the strap of her backpack as if it were an anchor holding her to reality. John's jacket was still draped over her shoulders. "You can sleep here tonight," John said. "Tomorrow morning, I'll help you figure things out. But right now, you need to rest." It had taken nearly an hour filled with gentle questions and patient silences before John finally convinced Anna to leave the bus stop. She didn't trust him. but her exhausted body had given in where her mind still resisted. Anna nodded, a nod so small it was almost imperceptible. John brought out a clean blanket and laid it over the arm of the sofa, then retreated into the bedroom, giving her space and privacy. Only when the sound of John's footsteps faded behind the half-closed bedroom door did Anna dare to exhale. She slowly lay down, pulling the blanket up to her chin. Her eyes gradually closed, but sleep did not come easily. It came like a wave, carrying her back and forth along the thin line between reality and memory. 3 days earlier, the living room of the house in the Aurora neighborhood was still heavy with the scent of white lilies, the flowers from her father's funeral that morning. Anna stood in the middle of the room, her hand clenched tightly around a small navy blue suitcase, a birthday gift her father had given her when she turned 10. Back when things were still good, back when he was still there. Linda, the woman her father had married 2 years earlier, stood by the window, her back to Anna. "You're 12 years old," Linda said coldly, without a trace of emotion. "Old enough to understand that I have no obligation to raise someone else's child." Anna didn't cry. She had already cried herself dry at her father's grave. What remained inside her now was only a painful emptiness, like a deep hollow that swallowed every feeling. Linda turned around, her brown eyes resting on Anna with a look of weary indifference. "This is $500, bus fare, and enough for you to find your own way for a while." A white envelope was placed on the coffee table, sitting between them like a final boundary between the past and the future. Anna looked at the envelope. $500, the value of 2 years under the same roof, of silent dinners, of all those times she had tried to say, "Mum," just to make her father happy. "I don't need it," Anna said, her voice quiet but firm. She turned and pulled the suitcase toward the door. "Take it," Linda said. "I don't want anyone saying I was cruel." Anna stopped. That word cruel cut into the fragile sense of dignity of a 12-year-old child. Not because it hurt, but because she understood she was being judged by appearances, not by love. She turned back and picked up the envelope, not because she needed the money, but because she wanted closure, because she didn't want to owe anyone anything, because she wanted to leave with the last shred of dignity left to a 12-year-old who had learned not to beg. The door closed behind Anna with a dry click. She stood on the front porch, the sunset bathing the street in gold, the small suitcase at her feet, the envelope of money in her pocket, and before her lay a vast world, one she had no idea where to go in. But Anna didn't cry. That 12-year-old girl simply lifted her head and pulled the suitcase along with steps that trembled, yet remained determined, because the deepest wound was not being abandoned. It was being treated like a burden, like something unwanted, like an existence unworthy of care. And she would prove, if only to herself, that she was not worthless. Even if she was only 12, even if the world was vast and frightening, she would survive. On her own, on the sofa in John's apartment, Anna jolted awake. Her breathing was fast, her hands clenched tight around the blanket. The room was still quiet, the soft light unchanged. From the bedroom, she could hear John's steady breathing, the sound of someone sleeping without fear, trusting that the world, for the moment, was at peace. Anna slowly relaxed her grip. For the first time in 3 days, she felt her shoulders drop just a little. Not trust, not hope, but at least a moment of relief. And for a 12-year-old girl who had learned to survive in the darkness, that was already more than she had dared to expect. The first week in John Miller's apartment passed like a piece of music without a melody, scattered notes that didn't quite come together, filled with awkward pauses and empty spaces. Anna was set up in the small room that had once been John's storage space, a narrow room with a single bed, an old desk, and a window that looked out onto the backyard, where old maple trees swayed in the wind. John had cleaned through half the night, dusting and wiping everything down, trying to turn the cold, unused space into something that could be called home. But Anna didn't see it as home. She saw it as a temporary stop. On the first morning, John got up early and struggled his way through making breakfast. Oil popped and sizzled in the pan. A faint, burnt smell hung in the air. John frowned at the skillet, egg yolks running everywhere. Bacon burned on one side. "Good morning," he said when Anna stepped into the living room. Her blonde hair tousled, her eyes still carrying the guarded look of those first days. She gave a small nod, polite, but distant. No greeting, no smile. John set the plate down on the table. I'm not very good at cooking," he admitted, "but you need to eat breakfast." Anna looked at the plate, then at John. Something flickered across her eyes, perhaps sympathy, perhaps amusement, but she didn't say anything. She simply sat down, picked up her fork, and ate slowly, carefully, one small bite at a time. John sat across from her, trying to find something to talk about. Do you like reading? A nod. I've got a few books in my room. You can read them any time. Another nod. The silence stretched on like an endless ribbon. John realized that the communication skills he had mastered, clear commands, brief reports, were completely useless with a 12-year-old girl who was building walls around her heart. On the third day, John decided to buy Anna a gift. He went to a toy store at the mall and stood there, surrounded by long aisles of dolls, stuffed animals, and bright pink toys. After some hesitation, he picked a small brown teddy bear with a red ribbon, thinking it was a safe choice. When he got home, he handed the bear to Anna. She looked at it, her expression blank. "Thank you," she said politely, but coolly. Then she set the bear on the shelf and turned back to the window. John stood there, a quiet sense of failure settling in his chest. He realized he had misunderstood. Anna wasn't a child who needed comfort in the form of toys. She was a child who had grown up too soon, someone who had crossed out of childhood without ever being allowed to enjoy it. "What do you want?" John asked, sincerely. "I want to help, but I don't know how." Anna turned back, meeting his eyes directly for the first time, without avoidance, without suspicion. "I want books," she said, "and paper and pens. I like to write." It was a simple sentence, but it was the first time Anna had shared something about herself. John nodded, relieved. "Tomorrow, I'll take you to a bookstore." A small smile, very small, like a thin ray of sunlight breaking through clouds, appeared on Anna's lips. Then she turned back to the window, but this time her shoulders were no longer as tense. On the fifth day, another kitchen disaster struck. John tried to make dinner spaghetti with tomato sauce. He dumped an entire jar of sauce into the pot, added seasoning by instinct, and ended up with a sauce that was too salty, too sour, with a faint burnt smell. He stood at the stove, wooden spoon in hand, sweat beading on his forehead. Why is this so hard? A small figure appeared beside him. Anna, wearing her oversized hoodie, studied the pot with a thoughtful look. "You added too much salt," she said calmly, as if analyzing a math problem. John turned to her, surprised. You know how to cook?" "My dad taught me," Anna said, then hesitated before adding, "Before, my dad used to cook with me on weekends." It was the first time she had mentioned her father. Her voice trembled slightly, but she didn't cry. "Can you fix it?" John asked, stepping back. Anna looked at the sauce, then at John. After a brief pause, she nodded. She stepped up to the stove, turned down the heat, added a little sugar to balance the acidity, poured in some water to reduce the saltiness, and stirred with a confidence unexpected in a 12-year-old. John stood beside her, watching. In that moment, the roles reversed. The adult became the student, the child, the teacher. "All done," Anna said, turning off the stove. "Now it's okay to eat." They sat down together at the table, 2 plates of steaming spaghetti in front of them. John took a bite. The sauce was balanced. Not too sour, not too salty. "You're really good," he said honestly. Anna looked down at her plate, her cheeks faintly pink. I just remember what my dad taught me. This silence was different. No longer awkward, no longer distant. It was the silence of understanding two people, each carrying their own wounds, learning how to exist together. That night, as John passed by Anna's room, he heard the sound of a pencil scratching against paper. He glanced quietly through the slightly open door. She was sitting at the desk, head tilted, writing intently. John didn't interrupt. He stood there for a few seconds, then walked away softly. In that small wooden apartment, amid the silences and the tentative steps, something was beginning to change. Not yet a father and daughter bond, not yet complete trust, but it was presence. And sometimes, that is how love begins, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, in small steps, like the first light of dawn slipping through the cracks in the curtains. On Saturday afternoon, rare Seattle sunshine filtered through the windows, casting a golden glow across the small living room. John was fixing the broken kitchen sink faucet. Anna sat on the sofa, the old book John had bought for her at a used bookstore lying open on her lap. But she was no longer reading. Her eyes were fixed on John's back, on the long scar that ran from his right shoulder down toward his shoulder blade, like a dried riverbed cutting through the desert of his skin. The scar was uneven, raised, pale pink with hints of purple. It was a mark left by time enough for flesh to heal, but never to forget. Anna set the book aside, her fingers gripping the hem of her shirt. She hesitated, then spoke, her voice so soft it seemed afraid of breaking the quiet moment. "Uncle John." John lifted his head from beneath the sink, a wrench still in his hand. "What is it, Anna?" Her eyes flicked to the scar, then dropped to the floor. Does it hurt?" A simple question, but the way she asked it, the slight tremor in her voice, the distant look in her eyes told John this wasn't ordinary curiosity. It was the question of someone who had known pain and was searching for connection through another person's wounds. John slowly stood up, wiped his hands on a towel, and sat down across from Anna, not close enough to pressure her, but close enough to show sincerity. "It doesn't hurt anymore," he said, his voice low and steady. "But back then, yes, it hurt a lot." Anna gave a small nod, as if his answer confirmed something she already knew. "What happened?" John hesitated. He wasn't used to talking about the past. Those memories were still heavy, like stones carried in the pockets of his old uniform. But looking into Anna's eyes of a child learning how to trust, he decided to share. "I was a soldier," he began, "in Afghanistan. One day, my unit was moving through a small village. There was a loud explosion, an artillery strike. Shrapnel hit my shoulder." He paused, his gaze drifting. "I was lucky. A buddy pulled me out of there. But this scar, it reminds me that you can't always control everything." Anna listened without interrupting. She looked at the scar differently now, not with curiosity, but with respect. "My dad was a soldier too," she said softly, almost whispering. "He didn't talk much about it, but sometimes I saw him dreaming. He'd shout in his sleep, then wake up and sit by the window all night." It was the first time Anna spoke about her father on her own, not because John asked, but because she felt she could. John nodded. "The battlefield leaves a lot behind, kiddo. Not just scars on the skin, but scars in the mind. Do you have those dreams?" Anna asked, her eyes meeting his. John exhaled slowly. "Yes, many times, but I've learned to live with them, like learning to live with this scar." Anna looked down at her hands, small hands belonging to a 12-year-old girl who had already carried too much pain. "I have scars too," she said, "but no one can see them." Her voice trembled, like a yellow leaf falling in the wind. John leaned forward, resting his hands on his knees, looking at Anna with quiet warmth. "I know," he said. "I can see them." Anna looked up, surprised. "Not with my eyes," John explained, "but in the way you look at the world, the way you're always on guard, the way you don't let anyone get close. I understand, because I was like that too." The silence stretched between them, but this time it wasn't heavy. It felt like a bridge, two people, two generations, two different painful stories, sharing one thing in common, an understanding of hurt. Anna slowly stood and stepped closer to John. She stood in front of him, looked at the scar, then gently, very gently reached out and touched it. John flinched. No one ever touched that scar. He always hid it, ashamed of what he saw as a mark of weakness. But when Anna's small fingers brushed his skin, he didn't pull away. "It's like a map," Anna said softly. "A map that leads you home." John swallowed, emotion rising. "Your scars are like that too," he said. "They don't define who you are. They only prove that you survived." Anna withdrew her hand but didn't step away. She stood there, looking at John with new eyes, no longer wary, no longer distant. They were the eyes of a child learning to trust, one small step at a time. I think you're broken inside too," she said, her voice shaking. "Like me," John nodded, tears shining but not falling. "That's right. I am broken too. But that doesn't mean we can't be put back together." Anna looked down at the floor, then back at him. Can you teach me how to put myself back together?" That question, simple, direct, filled with fragile hope, broke through the last barrier in John's heart. He held out his hand and waited. After a few hesitant seconds, Anna placed her small hand in his. "I'll try," John said, his voice thick. "I don't have all the answers, but I'll be here, walking with you, step by step." Anna squeezed his hand. For the first time, she didn't feel alone. In the next room, Anna lay on her bed, her arms wrapped around her book, but she wasn't reading. She stared at the ceiling, thinking about the scar on John's shoulder, the stories he had told, the feeling of his warm hand holding hers, and for the first time since her father was gone, Anna felt that maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't have to walk alone anymore. The social services office on 3rd Avenue was filled with harsh fluorescent lighting and the stale smell of old paperwork. John sat on a hard plastic chair, holding a stack of temporary guardianship forms, while Anna sat beside him, her hand gripping the strap of her backpack, her familiar gesture of safety. The social worker, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Patterson, with grey hair and thick-framed glasses, reviewed the file with a serious expression. "Mr. Miller, to complete the temporary placement for Anna, we'll need her birth certificate and her father's death certificate," she said, her tone professional but not unkind. Anna quietly handed over an envelope the documents she had guarded throughout her days on the street. Inside was a birth certificate with neat handwriting. Anna Marie Reed, born the 15th of March 2013, and the certificate, the paper Anna never wanted to look at again, clearly stating, "Thomas Andrew Reed, deceased the 10th of November 2025. John took the papers from Mrs. Patterson to look them over. His eyes moved line by line, then stopped at a name, Thomas Andrew Reed. Time seemed to freeze. That name, Thomas Reed. It echoed in John's mind like a bell from a distant past, pulling him back to Afghanistan, to days of sand-filled skies, to nights standing watch beside brothers in arms. Thomas Reed, Tommy. John's hand trembled slightly, the papers slipping onto his lap. He looked at Anna, the girl sitting beside him, blonde hair falling to her shoulders, blue eyes that looked exactly like Tommy's. "Mr. Miller, are you all right?" Mrs. Patterson asked, concern in her voice. John swallowed hard, struggling to contain the shock surging through him. I need a moment," he said thickly. "Excuse me." He stood and walked quickly into the hallway, leaving Anna behind with Mrs. Patterson, confused and unsure. The hallway was empty. John leaned against the cold wall, his hands shaking as he pulled out his phone, but he didn't call anyone. He just needed space to breathe, to process the storm tearing through his chest. Thomas Reed. Tommy. He closed his eyes, and the memories came rushing back. 12 years earlier, Kandahar, Afghanistan, rolling clouds of dust, the roar of helicopters overhead. John's squad was on a border patrol mission. The heat was brutal, sweat pouring down, tension stretched to the breaking point. Then the explosion, a sudden artillery strike. John was thrown to the ground, shrapnel tearing into his shoulder, pain like fire. He screamed, trying to crawl toward cover, but his legs wouldn't respond. And then someone was there, a strong figure running toward him, hauling him up, throwing him over a shoulder despite bullets still raining down. Thomas Reed. Tommy. "I'm not leaving you behind, Miller," Tommy shouted through the blasts. "You're going home." Tommy dragged John to shelter, but in that moment another piece of shrapnel struck Tommy's leg. He went down but still didn't let go of John. They were both evacuated to base. John survived, but Tommy's injuries were worse. His leg never fully recovered. His military career was over. He was discharged early, carrying disability papers and dreams left unfinished. John remembered the last time he saw Tommy, his friend, sitting in a temporary wheelchair, eyes still bright, forcing a smile through the pain. "Go home, Miller," Tommy said. "Live well, that's an order." That was the last time John saw him. After that, they lost touch. John returned to the States, trying to rebuild his life. He had wanted to reach out, but guilt held him back. Guilt for surviving while Tommy lost everything. Now, standing in the hallway of the social services office, John realized the brutal truth. Tommy was gone, and his daughter, the small girl John had met by chance at a bus stop, was sitting inside, alone, with nowhere else to go. She was Tommy's daughter. The weight of debt crashed over him like a tidal wave. John didn't just owe Tommy his life, he owed him a future. A future Tommy had sacrificed so John could have his own. He steadied himself and went back into the office. Anna looked up at him, worry in her eyes. "I'm okay," John said gently. "I'm sorry." He sat down and finished the paperwork with Mrs. Patterson. When they left the office, John took Anna's hand not out of obligation, but because of a silent promise he had just made to himself. That night, after Anna had gone to sleep, John opened an old metal box in his closet where he kept his military keepsakes. He searched through it until he found the photograph. A black and white photo, its corners worn. The entire squad stood together, taken before a mission. John was on the left, younger, his face still unlined, his eyes still unburdened, and beside him, smiling brightly, stood Thomas Reed, Tommy, his friend, the man who saved his life, Anna's father. John gently touched Tommy's face in the photo, tears streaming down his cheeks. "I'm sorry, Tommy," he whispered. I didn't know what you went through. But now I do." He looked toward Anna's bedroom door, a sliver of light still glowing beneath it. She was asleep, unaware that the man outside was carrying a promise heavier than anything he had ever known. "I'll protect her, Anna," John said softly, his voice trembling but firm. "With my life. That's my promise to her father." He pressed the photo to his chest and closed his eyes. Silent tears fell, but in his heart, a new fire had just been lit. No longer just compassion, no longer just duty. On Sunday evening, a gentle Seattle rain fell outside the window. Anna sat on the bed in her small room, her worn old backpack resting on her lap. She had never really gone through this backpack carefully. During her days on the street, she had only taken out clothes and a few necessities. But tonight, a strange, insistent feeling urged her to look again, as if something was waiting to be found. She turned the backpack upside down, rummaging through each compartment. Old clothes, a toothbrush, her notebook. Then, at the very bottom, beneath the fabric lining, her fingers touched something hard. An envelope. Anna pulled it out. It was pale yellow, slightly wrinkled, carefully sealed. On the front, a familiar handwritten line, her father's handwriting, made her heart tighten. "To John Miller." Anna's hands began to shake. She stared at the words as if they were a message sent from the past, from a father who was gone but still trying to protect her from the other side of the world. He knew. He knew she would find John. With trembling fingers, Anna opened the envelope. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, written in dark blue ink, the familiar slanted handwriting of her father. She unfolded it, her eyes moving slowly across the lines. "John, if you're reading this letter, it means I'm no longer here. I know this is hard to believe. I never imagined I'd have to write these words myself. But life doesn't give us much time to prepare, does it? I'm writing this because of Anna, my daughter. She's 12 years old, stronger than I ever thought a child could be. But the world is too big, too frightening for her to face alone. She needs someone to guide her. She needs someone I can trust. And I trust only you, John. Please find her and take care of my girl. I will never forget that day in Kandahar. You said I saved your life, but the truth is, you gave me a purpose. When I pulled you out of danger, I felt that I mattered. I felt I had done something right in the middle of a war filled with wrongs. Now I'm asking you to do the same for Anna. Not to save her life, but to save her future. She'll need time to trust. She'll build walls around herself. But I know you understand you were like that once too. Be patient with her, John. Show her that not everyone leaves. Show her that family isn't just blood, but the people who stay, even when the storm comes. I'm not sorry for placing this burden on your shoulders, because I know if there's anyone in this world who can do this, it's you. Thank you, my friend. Thank you for everything. Thomas Reed, Tommy. The final lines blurred in Anna's vision. Tears spilled freely. Her first tears since the funeral, the tears she had forced herself to hold back for weeks. She pressed the letter to her chest, her whole body trembling. Her father hadn't abandoned her. He had prepared. He had found a way to protect her, even after he was gone. He knew. He always knew. Anna's sobs, soft, broken sounds filled with longing and grief, rather than screams, echoed through the small room. John, sitting in the living room with a book, heard them. He stood up, walked to Anna's door, and knocked gently. "Are you okay?" he asked, worry in his voice. There was no answer, only muffled crying. John opened the door. Anna sat on the bed, clutching the letter, tears streaming down her face. She looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen, then held the letter out with trembling hands. Please read it," she said, her voice choked. John took the letter and read, his eyes moving line by line. When he reached the end, he could no longer hold back his tears either. Tommy, his best friend, his brother in arms, even in death, he had trusted John with the most precious thing he had, his daughter. "Tommy," John whispered, his voice breaking. Anna looked at him, then slowly stood and stepped closer. She looked straight into his eyes. You knew my dad?" she asked, her voice shaking. John nodded, tears falling freely. "I did. Your father was the best man I ever knew. He saved my life. And now I understand why I found you." "It wasn't an accident," Anna said softly. It was my dad." "That's right," John said, kneeling so they were eye to eye. "Your father wanted me to take care of you, and I promise I will. Not out of obligation, but because you're Tommy's daughter. You're my family." The word family, a word Anna thought she had lost forever, reached her heart like warm sunlight. She couldn't hold back anymore. She threw her arms around John and clung to him, sobbing. "I miss my dad. I miss him so much," she cried into his chest. John wrapped his arms tightly around her, one hand gently stroking her hair. I know. But your dad is still here, in your heart, and I'm here too. I'm not going anywhere." They held each other in the small room, under the soft light, with rain falling outside the window. The wall Anna had built out of fear, pain, and long lonely days finally collapsed. No more distance between uncle and child. No more strangers sharing a roof. Now, they were family. A family bound by friendship, by sacrifice, by a love that needed no shared blood to be real. That night, as Anna fell asleep in the safety of John's arms for the first time since her father had passed, she dreamed of him. He stood in sunlight, smiling, then slowly faded away. But this time, Anna wasn't afraid, because she knew her father had led her somewhere safe. On Thursday afternoon, Seattle's sunlight slipped through thin clouds, casting pale streaks of light across the wooden floor of the living room. Anna was sitting at the table doing homework, the math exercises John had bought for her to prepare for going back to school. Life over the past 2 weeks had begun to find a rhythm. Breakfast together, quiet afternoons, and small conversations before bedtime. The doorbell rang sudden, like a clap of thunder. John was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. He wiped his hands on a towel and went to open the door, and when the door opened, time seemed to stop. Standing there was Linda, the woman with neatly tied brown hair, carefully applied makeup, and a tailored black blazer. Beside her stood a middle-aged man in a grey suit, holding a leather briefcase, clearly a lawyer. "Mr. Miller," Linda said, her voice cold but polite. "We need to talk about Anna." John stood in the doorway, blocking the entrance, his eyes alert. "Who are you?" "I'm Linda Reed, Anna's stepmother," she replied, gesturing to the man beside her. "And this is my attorney, Mr. Martin Hayes. We're here to resolve a legal matter regarding guardianship." From inside the room, Anna heard Linda's voice. She stood up, gripping the edge of the table, her face draining of color. Memories of the day she was thrown out of the house surged back, tightening her chest. John glanced back at Anna with a reassuring look, then turned to face the uninvited guests. "Anna is safe here," John said firmly. "I'm in the process of legally applying for temporary guardianship." Attorney Martin Hayes stepped forward, his tone professional but cold. "Mr. Miller, Mrs. Reed is the sole legal guardian of Anna under the will of Thomas Reed. Keeping the child here without the guardian's consent could be considered a violation." "The child doesn't want to live with her," John replied sharply. "She threw Anna out of the house." Linda sighed, putting on a look of practiced sadness. "I understand there were misunderstandings. I was going through a difficult time after my husband passed. I acted without thinking, but now I'm ready to bring Anna home." "No," Anna's voice came from inside the room, soft but steady. Linda glanced in, a flash of coldness passing through her eyes before she replaced it with a gentle smile. "Anna, sweetheart, I know you're upset, but home is where you belong." Anna stepped out and stood behind John, as if seeking shelter. "I don't want to go back. Uncle John takes care of me." Attorney Martin opened his briefcase and pulled out a set of documents. "There's a legal matter we need to clarify. Mr. Thomas Reed left behind a life insurance policy worth $250,000, with Anna as the sole beneficiary. However, since Anna is a minor, the legal guardian will manage those assets until she turns 18. John frowned. He understood immediately. This wasn't about love, it was about money. Linda stepped closer, her voice smooth but sharp as a blade. "Mr. Miller, I respect your desire to help, but do you understand that raising a child requires substantial financial resources? You work in a warehouse and live in this small apartment. Can you really offer Anna a better future?" Those words, wrapped in a veneer of concern, cut into John's sense of dignity. But he didn't let them shake him. "Money doesn't make a family," John said. "Love does." Linda smiled coolly. "Love doesn't pay tuition, Mr. Miller. And the court will consider what's best for Anna, a stable household with sufficient financial means, or a single man with limited income." Attorney Martin added firmly, "We will file a petition requesting the court to reconsider guardianship. If you try to keep Anna here, it will only prolong the legal process and cause further harm to the child." Anna stood behind John, her whole body trembling. Words like court, legal, and financial spun in her head like a storm. She was only 12, too young to understand all the complexities of the adult world, but old enough to feel afraid. Linda turned to Anna, her voice gentle but laced with poison. "Anna, do you really think Mr. Miller truly wants you? He's just a stranger, a former soldier with psychological issues. Are you sure you want to live with someone like that?" "Don't say that," Anna cried, her voice shaking. But Linda continued, each word striking at Anna's deepest fears. "Don't you think you're a burden to him? He has to work so hard to support you. He has to give up his own life. Do you really want to be that kind of burden?" "That's enough," John said loudly, his voice decisive. "Get out of my house, now." Linda didn't flinch. She simply looked at Anna, her gaze icy. "Anna, I'll be back. And when I am, you'll have to choose. Come with me and have a good future, or stay here and watch him collapse under the pressure." Attorney Martin placed a document on the table. "This is a legal notice. The hearing will take place in 2 weeks. You should prepare your attorney, Mr. Miller." They turned and walked out. The sound of Linda's heels echoed down the hallway, then faded. John closed the door, his hands trembling slightly. He turned to Anna. She stood there, pale, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Anna," John stepped closer. Do you really want me here?" Anna asked, her voice quivering. "Am I making things hard for you?" "No," John said, kneeling down and taking her hands. "I want you here. I want to take care of you. Don't let her words confuse you." But Anna pulled her hands away and stepped back. But she's right. You have to work so hard. You have to worry about me. I don't want to ruin your life." "You're not ruining anything," John said, his voice breaking. "You're a gift. You're the reason I have a purpose." But Linda's words had already planted seeds of doubt in Anna's mind. She was 12, too young to understand that love doesn't come with conditions, but old enough to fear that she was a burden. She turned and ran into her room, slamming the door shut. John stood alone in the living room, a crushing sense of helplessness settling over him like a mountain. Linda hadn't used force. She had used something far more dangerous: manipulative words, sowing doubt in a heart that was just learning how to trust. And now, the battle was no longer only legal. It was a battle to reclaim the trust of a young girl wavering between fear and hope. The wall clock struck 2 in the morning, when John woke with an unexplained sense of unease. The room was steeped in darkness, with only the glow of a streetlight slipping through the gap in the curtains, casting faint, shifting shadows. He lay still, listening, but there was no sound. Too quiet. A powerful instinct pushed him to get up. John walked to Anna's door and knocked softly. No answer. He opened the door. Light from the hallway spilled in, illuminating an empty bed. The blanket was neatly folded, the pillow perfectly arranged, as if Anna had never been there at all. John's heart began to pound. He flipped on the light. The room was bare. The old backpack was gone. On the desk lay a small piece of paper, placed carefully, bearing Anna's slanted handwriting. "Uncle John, I'm sorry. I don't want you to get into trouble because of me. Linda was right. I'm just a burden. You've been so good to me, but I have to go. Don't look for me. I'll be okay." Anna, John's hands trembled as he held the note. A deep chill spread through his chest, as if his heart had been wrung dry. The feeling of loss, so familiar from the dark days when fellow soldiers had been lost, hit him with crushing force. No, not this time. John rushed into the living room, grabbed his jacket, shoved his phone into his pocket. He bolted out the door, down the stairs, and into the empty Seattle streets of the late night. Rain began to fall, first light and misty, then heavier, soaking the pavement. John ran down the street, his eyes scanning everywhere. The abandoned bus stop where he had first met Anna was empty. The familiar street corner, no sign of her. Where did she go? Where would she go? Then a thought flashed through John's mind. The cemetery, where her father rested. He sprinted to the parking lot, fired up his old pickup, and sped through the deserted roads. Rain poured down relentlessly, the wipers working non-stop, but barely clearing his view. John didn't slow down. He couldn't. Evergreen Cemetery lay on the northern outskirts of Seattle, where rows of old oak trees shaded weathered headstones. When John arrived, it was still pitch dark, lit only by distant streetlights casting a dim glow. He parked and ran inside. The ground was slick beneath his feet, rain soaking through his clothes. He ran past row after row of graves, searching desperately. And then he saw her, a small figure, huddled beside a fresh headstone, the grave of Thomas Reed. Anna sat there, knees drawn to her chest, her face drenched with rain and tears. Her backpack lay beside her, soaked through. "Anna!" John shouted, his voice breaking through the rain-soaked night. She startled and looked up. When she saw John, her eyes filled with both fear and relief. John ran to her and dropped to his knees, gripping her shoulders. "What are you doing here? Do you know how scared I was?" Anna sobbed, her tears mixing with the rain. I didn't want you to get into trouble. Linda is going to sue you. I don't want to ruin your life." "Ruin?" John said, his voice thick. "You think you ruin my life?" "I'm just a burden," Anna said, shaking. "You have to worry. You have to face the courts. I don't deserve it." John held her shoulders firmly, looking straight into her eyes. "Listen to me, Anna. I don't need money. I don't need peace and quiet. I need you safe." Anna shook her head, tears pouring down. "But you'll lose everything because of me." "I have nothing to lose," John shouted, emotion flooding his voice. "Before I met you, I was just a man living alone, with no purpose. You gave me a reason to live, a reason to get up every morning. You are not a burden. You are a gift." "But Linda said," "She's wrong," John cut in sharply. "She just wants the money. But me, I want you. I want to hear you laugh. I want to teach you how to cook, sit and read with you. I want to see you grow up safe and happy." The rain fell harder, soaking them both. But John didn't let go. He looked at Anna with fierce resolve. "Come home, sweetheart," he said, his voice trembling. "Come home with Dad." The word sweetheart, spoken without thought, stopped Anna cold. And Dad, a word John had never dared to claim, now rang out like an unbreakable promise. Anna stared at him, eyes wide. Then she threw herself into his arms, clinging to him and sobbing. "I was scared. I was so scared," she cried against his chest. "I know," John said, holding her tight, one hand gently stroking her hair. "But I'm here now. I won't let you go anywhere. I promise." They held each other in the cemetery, under the night rain, beside the grave of Thomas Reed, as if Tommy were watching from somewhere beyond, smiling, at peace knowing his daughter had found where she belonged. John helped Anna to her feet and draped his jacket over her shoulders. "Let's go home, sweetheart. It's cold." Anna nodded, but before leaving, she turned back to her father's grave. She placed her hand on the cold stone and whispered, "Dad, I've found my home. I'm going to be okay." Then she turned back and took John's hand. Together they walked out of the cemetery, hand in hand, like father and daughter, not by blood, but by choice, by love, by promises made in the rain. On the way home, Anna rested her head against John's shoulder, exhausted but at peace. For the first time, she wasn't running anymore. For the first time, she believed someone would stay, no matter the storm. And John, the man who once thought he didn't deserve a family, now understood that family wasn't something he was born to have. It was something he would fight to protect. They went home not as two strangers sharing a roof, but as father and daughter, ready to face whatever lay ahead together. The King County Courthouse in Seattle stood imposing, with its granite columns and heavy oak doors. On Tuesday morning, sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows, casting golden streaks across the polished marble floor. John Miller sat on a hard wooden bench, his hands clasped tightly together, his black suit, the only one he owned, slightly tight across the shoulders. Beside him, Anna sat in a simple navy blue dress, her blonde hair neatly tied back. She stared straight ahead, her expression calm yet deep, like the ocean before a storm. Across the courtroom, Linda Reed sat next to attorney Martin Hayes, dressed in an elegant black suit, her hair carefully styled. She looked at Anna with a soft, practiced smile, a smile meant for the judge, not for the child. The courtroom doors opened. "All rise," the court clerk announced, the Honorable Judge Robert Harrison presiding. The judge entered, a man in his early 60s, with grey hair and a stern face softened by quiet compassion. On his lapel was a small pin, the emblem of the United States Navy. John recognized it immediately. The judge was a veteran. "Please be seated," Judge Harrison said in a deep, authoritative voice. He opened the file and looked through his reading glasses. Today's case concerns the guardianship of Anna Marie Reed. Mrs. Linda Reed petitions for the return of guardianship, while Mr. John Miller seeks permanent, legal guardianship. He looked up at both sides. "Before hearing arguments from counsel, I want to hear directly from Anna. At age 12, she has the legal right to be heard." Attorney Martin Hayes stood. "Your Honor, we are concerned that the child may be influenced." "Sit down, Mr. Hayes," Judge Harrison said firmly. "The child has the right to speak." He turned to Anna. "Anna, would you like to say something?" Anna stood, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She walked to the front of the courtroom and stopped where the judge could see her clearly. She took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice not loud, but clear and steady. "Your Honor, my name is Anna Reed. I am 12 years old, and I want to tell the truth." The courtroom fell silent, every eye focused on the small girl standing there with the dignity of an adult. Anna turned toward Linda. "Linda is my father's wife, but she is not my mother. My mother passed away when I was very young. My father married Linda when I was 10. She gave me a room, she gave me meals, but she never gave me love." Linda lowered her head, wearing an expression of sorrow. But Anna continued. "When my father died," she said, her voice trembling slightly but not stopping, "she threw me out of the house. She said I was old enough to take care of myself. She gave me money and told me to leave." Judge Harrison frowned and looked at Linda. "Mrs. Reed, is this true?" Attorney Hayes stood again. "Your Honor, Mrs. Reed was under severe emotional distress at the time. That decision was a temporary mistake, one she deeply regrets." Anna shook her head. "It wasn't regret, Your Honor. She only came back when she found out I inherited life insurance money." The statement landed like a bomb in the courtroom. Linda jumped to her feet. "Anna, don't say that. I truly care about you." "No," Anna said, her voice frighteningly calm. "You don't. You only want the money. But I don't need money. I need a home." She turned back to the judge, her eyes clear. "Your Honor, Uncle John gave me that. He found me at a bus stop, cold and alone. He didn't know who I was. He didn't know about the insurance. He only knew I needed help." Her voice trembled, but she did not cry. "He taught me how to cook. He reads with me. He sits beside me when I have nightmares. He isn't perfect, he's a bad cook. His apartment is small, and he works very hard. But he gives me something Linda never did. He gives me unconditional love." Anna looked directly at the judge. "She gave me a roof, but Uncle John gave me a home. I would rather eat canned soup with him than steak in her cold house." The courtroom was completely silent. Even Attorney Hayes had no response. Linda slowly sat down, her face pale, realizing that anything she said now would be meaningless. Judge Harrison looked at Anna with deep respect. "You are very brave, Anna. Thank you for speaking." He turned to John. "Mr. Miller, would you like to add anything?" John stood, his voice shaking. "Your Honor, Anna has already said everything. She is far stronger than I am. I only want to add this. Anna's father, Thomas Reed, was the best friend I ever had. He saved my life in Afghanistan, and now I want to honor him by protecting his daughter, not for money, not out of obligation, but because she is my family." Judge Harrison nodded and looked down at the file. He remained silent for several moments, moments that felt like centuries to John and Anna. Then he spoke. "The court has reviewed all evidence. The court finds that Mrs. Linda Reed, though initially the legal guardian, failed to fulfill her duty of care to Anna. Mr. John Miller, on the other hand, has demonstrated genuine commitment and the ability to provide a stable, loving environment." He looked directly at Anna, then at John. "Full legal guardianship is hereby granted to Mr. John Miller. Mrs. Linda Reed's guardianship rights are terminated." The gavel struck the bench sharp and final, ending the battle. Anna turned to John. Tears, this time tears of joy, streamed down her face. She ran to him and threw her arms around him. "Dad," she cried, "I have a dad now." John held her tightly, tears rolling down his own cheeks. "That's right, sweetheart. I have you." They embraced in the middle of the courtroom, under Judge Harrison's respectful gaze and the quiet witness of everyone present. Linda stood, turned away, and walked out without a word. And in the heart of the courthouse, beneath the Seattle sunlight filtering through the tall windows, a new family formed not by blood, but by courage, by love, and by choice was officially born. The following spring in Seattle was awash in green. The maple trees in the backyard of John Miller's home pushed out fresh buds, their new leaves shimmering softly in the gentle sunlight. The air carried the scent of damp earth and wildflowers, the smell of life rising again after a long winter. Anna Reed, now 13, knelt beside a freshly turned garden bed, holding a small trowel, carefully digging holes to plant sunflower seeds. Her blonde hair was tied back in a high ponytail, her face lightly sun-kissed, her blue eyes brighter than before, no longer guarded as they had been the year before, but calm and confident. She had grown taller, her shoulders straighter, her movements more composed than those of other kids her age. Life had taught her resilience early, but now she was also learning how to smile. "Dad, you're digging too deep," Anna said, glancing over at John, who was wrestling with a hole far larger than necessary. "Seeds only need to be buried a few centimeters." John looked up, sweat beading on his forehead, and laughed. "I figured the deeper, the better." "No," Anna shook her head, her voice patient, like a teacher correcting a student. "If you plant them too deep, they won't get enough light to sprout. Plants need balance deep enough to be safe, but close enough to the surface to grow." John nodded, listening closely. "You really know your stuff. I've learned a lot from you." Anna smiled, a gentle but sincere smile. "Thomas taught me how to garden. When I was little, he and I planted a small flower garden at our old house. It was one of the rare times Anna spoke of her father without tears. The pain was still there, but it was no longer an open wound. It had become a scar, a reminder of love that once existed. John set the trowel down and sat beside her. "I think your dad would be very proud of you. You've grown so much." Anna looked down at the seeds, resting in her palm, tiny things, yet holding the promise of an entire garden. "I still miss him, but I know he'd want me to keep living, and I am together with you." John reached out and gently rested a hand on her shoulder. "I know, and I'm very glad you're here." They sat quietly for a few moments, listening to birds in the branches and the soft rustle of wind through the leaves. Then Anna laughed. "Dad, you still don't know how to use your smartphone, do you? This morning you texted me, but sent it to the neighborhood group chat instead." John groaned and chuckled, rubbing his head. "I don't even know what button does that. This technology is way too complicated." "I'll teach you," Anna said, pulling out her phone. She scooted closer and patiently showed him step by step how to unlock the screen, type a message, and make sure it went to the right person. John looked at his daughter with affection. A year earlier, she had been a frightened child, afraid to trust anyone. Now she was teaching him, the man who once thought he couldn't learn anything new, how to connect with the world. "You're really smart," John said. "So are you," Anna replied seriously. "You just need patience. Like gardening, you have to wait. You can't rush it." It was a lesson they had both learned over the past year. Patience, waiting, letting wounds heal, letting trust be built, letting love take root. That afternoon, as the sun began to set, they sat on the back steps, looking out over the newly planted garden. Neat rows of soil, seeds carefully buried, waiting for the day they would sprout. "Dad," Anna said, resting her head on John's shoulder. "I think I'm very lucky." John looked down at her, surprised. "Why do you think that?" "Because I have two fathers," Anna said. "One gave me life. The other taught me how to live. I lost one, but I found the other. Not everyone gets that kind of luck." Her voice trembled slightly, but there was no sadness in it. "I know my biological dad is watching me from somewhere, and I think he's happy that I have you." John pulled Anna into his arms, tears glistening in his eyes. "I'm lucky too, sweetheart. I thought my life ended on the battlefield, but you gave me a new purpose. You gave me a reason to keep going." Anna looked up at him. "So, we saved each other, didn't we?" John nodded. "Yes, we saved each other." That night, after Anna fell fast asleep in her room, a room now decorated with her drawings, shelves full of books, and soft, warm light, John sat in the living room, holding an old photo of his unit. He looked at the face of Thomas Reed, his friend, his brother, the man who had entrusted him with the most precious thing he had. "Thank you, Tommy," John whispered. "Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for giving me the chance to be a father. I promise I'll protect Anna. I'll love her as my own daughter, and I'll tell her about you, about the brave, kind man who loved her more than anything." He set the photo down and looked out the window. Outside, stars shimmered over the Seattle sky. The city was quiet, but inside this small house, there was a family formed not by blood, but by choice, by sacrifice, by unconditional love. The next morning, Anna woke early and ran out to the garden. She knelt beside the flower beds, checking each spot carefully. Nothing had sprouted yet, but she knew that with patience, it would. John came out carrying 2 mugs of hot cocoa. He handed one to Anna and sat beside her. "Dad," Anna said, looking at the garden beds, "I think this garden will be really beautiful next year." "I think so too," John said. "And you know what? Next year, we'll plant even more kinds of flowers. We'll make this the prettiest garden on the block." Anna smiled and took a sip of cocoa. I like that idea. They sat there together, father and daughter, looking at the garden waiting to grow. War had taken many things, loved ones, childhood innocence, peaceful days, but it hadn't taken hope. And from the ruins, from pain and loss, new shoots had begun to rise. A soldier found peace in his own home. A child found a second father. And together, they learned how to live again. Not perfectly, not easily, but together with love, with patience, with faith, they were building a new future. A future where flowers would bloom, where laughter would ring out, where family was not something inherited, but something chosen and protected with the heart. And beneath the clear Seattle sky, in a garden full of seeds, the story of John and Anna continued not as an ending, but as the beginning of a new chapter, filled with light and hope. The story of John and Anna is a reminder that sometimes what we need is not a miracle or an entirely new life, but the courage to stop and truly see the pain in a child's eyes, to recognize the silent plea hidden behind withdrawal and rough edges, and to realize that we ourselves are also in need of healing. Like a soldier returning from the battlefield, John found a new sense of purpose, not in the past or in lost glories, but right there in the cold city of Seattle, where a young girl was wandering through grief and loneliness. And in protecting Anna, John himself found family again, and with it, peace for his own soul. Every day, there are children quietly carrying pain they don't yet know how to name. Every day, there are adults full of scars, searching for a reason to keep going. And sometimes, fate brings them together not by accident, but because both are in need of saving. If this story has touched your heart, consider subscribing to the channel to continue walking alongside stories of family, healing, and hope. Because sometimes, a story that feels true enough can change the way we see the world and perhaps even change a life. Please share this story with the people you love, because the more people learn to listen to silence and recognize invisible wounds, the more children will be protected and loved in the way they deserve. And if you, or someone you know, is moving through a long, cold winter of life, remember this: there is always someone willing to pause, someone willing to stay. Spring will come. You deserve a place to call home. You deserve to be loved. Never give up, and never be afraid to choose to stay.